They did not begin as names, but as whispers, breathed low between the rows of cotton that blanketed the Mississippi earth like a pale shroud. The year was 1811. In Vicksburg, where the river's slow current dragged secrets along its muddy banks, and the overseers believed they owned not only the bodies bent beneath the sun, but also the very sound of breath. They thought they owned silence too. Yet silence has its rebellions, and the enslaved carried one in their throats. The story of two sisters who walked with chains yet bore storms in their eyes. Clara and Sarah Mayfield. No one recalled the exact hour they arrived. Some said they were taken upriver, dragged from a cabin where smoke still hung like a curse in the trees. Others swore the girls emerged from the swamps themselves, barefoot, faces marked with mud, silence coiling around them as thick as fog. What was remembered was the way overseers stiffened when they saw them, as though something had entered the fields that no whip could fully claim. Their backs bent with the others, their hands bled in the same way. But there was a shadow around them, a refusal that lived not in words but in the air itself. By day, they toiled among rows that seemed endless, stalks scratching skin raw while the sun stripped them to bone and sweat. Overseers barked, struck, and sneered, but Clara's head did not bow far enough for their liking, and Sarah's eyes, though young, held a stare too steady, too unbroken. To punish a stare is difficult, so they punished the body instead, lashes writing commands across their skin, waiting for screams that rarely came. The sisters' silence rattled the overseers more than any defiance could. At night, when darkness smothered the fields and the air carried the damp breath of the river, whispers began to flow between the cabins. Low voices, spoken with trembling lips, as if to name the sisters aloud was to summon something dangerous. "The Mayfields do not yield," some whispered. "The Mayfields are a storm," said others. Mothers hushed their children, warning them not to look too long into Clara's eyes or too deep into Sarah's, for storms destroy what they touch. And so their legend began not with fire nor with blood, but with silence. Silence so sharp it cut through chains, so heavy it pressed down on every throat that dared to speak of it. A silence that carried a promise, though none could yet say what it was. Clara remembered the fire. Sarah remembered the sound. Flames crawling along would like hungry insects, their father's voice breaking beneath fists, their mother's cry torn into the night like fabric ripped from a loom. They were girls then, but girlhood was brief, snatched by men who carried chains like rosaries, worshipping only cruelty. The sisters had been bound not by choice, but by absence, stripped of the home that had once smelled of cornmeal and river moss, left only with the raw memory of violence that could not be washed from their eyes. When they were dragged onto the plantation at Vicksburg, the overseer saw only two more bodies to break. They were lined with others beneath the sun, their hands pressed in a soil that refused to remember names. Yet the Mayfield sisters carried something the overseers could not whip out of them, the memory of loss. Clara's silence was iron, hammered in the fire of her father's last breath. Sarah's trembling was a river, endless, threatening to flood everything around it. Together they were not merely enslaved girls. They were remnants of a house burned to ash, children whose lullabies had been replaced by chains. The overseers mocked their quiet. They mistook Sarah's tears as weakness, Clara's unflinching gaze as stupidity. "These girls ain't got no fight in them," one spat, drawing laughter from the others. But in the cabins, when the day's heat bled into night and the whip's echo still hung in the air, the sisters did not sleep. Clara would trace the welts on Sarah's back with careful fingers, each scar another letter in an alphabet written by cruelty. Sarah, half asleep, would whisper the names of things they had lost, mother, river, bread, until her voice cracked and silence swallowed her whole. There were no lullabies in Vicksburg, no prayers that went unanswered long enough to matter. The only sound that lulled them to rest was the rhythm of chains shifting when bodies turned in their straw beds, a metallic hymn to captivity. And even in their dreams, the sisters could not escape. Clara often woke gasping, swearing she smelled smoke. Sarah woke, choking on cries that belonged to her mother, though the woman had long since vanished into the dark. The overseers thought silence meant defeat, but silence is also the echo of fire that waits for its fuel. Beneath Clara's stillness and Sarah's trembling lay the ashes of childhood, and ashes are not the end of fire. They are its beginning. The Mayfield plantation was a theater of cruelty, and yet, even there, the faintest glimmer of humanity sometimes flickered, like a candle trembling in a storm. It was a bitter winter night when Sarah, her hands cracked from labor, collapsed beside the water trough. Her body folded into itself, shaking with exhaustion. The overseers sneered and kept walking, their boots striking the frozen earth with contempt. Clara knelt at her sister's side, her silence heavy, but she had no water to give, no strength to carry. It seemed the world would watch Sarah wither and do nothing. But then, from the shadows of the slave quarters, an old woman shuffled forward. Her name was Ruth, her hair silver as frost, her eyes clouded with years of sorrow. She bent low and, with trembling hands, offered Sarah a chipped wooden cup filled with water. Just water, nothing more. Yet in that moment, it was a chalice of defiance. For kindness itself was rebellion on soil where cruelty was law. Sarah drank as if the cup held life itself, her lips trembling against the wood. Clara watched, her jaw tightening, her eyes dark. She was not one for tears, but that night she turned her face away, for fear her sister might see the wetness gathering there. Later, when the sisters lay in their cabin, Sarah whispered, "The world is not all stone, Clara." But her sister shook her head. "Stone is stronger than water," she said, her voice low and edged like broken glass. Yet, even as Clara spoke, she remembered the woman's trembling hand and the way Sarah's shoulders had stopped shaking after drinking. That small kindness, so fragile it could be crushed beneath a boot, had carved itself into her memory. The plantation could not forgive gestures like Ruth's. Whispers told of others who had dared offer crumbs of bread or seconds of shade, only to vanish by dawn. Still, for a heartbeat in a world ruled by fists, someone had bent the law of cruelty. And though it was small, though it was fleeting, it left a mark, a reminder that even amid darkness, kindness flickers. The sisters clung to that fragile ember, though both knew it would not last. On land where hope was outlawed, even a cup of water could damn the giver. But once given, it could not be taken back. Sarah's trembling eased that night. Clara's silence grew heavier, and deep in their hearts, the sisters understood. Fleeting kindness was more dangerous than cruelty, because it reminded them of what had been stolen. The months turned like a rusted wheel, each creak echoing with the overseer's cruelty. Whips cracked in the fields like thunder, and every strike carved silence deeper into Clara's face, carved fear deeper into Sarah's trembling bones. Yet cruelty alone did not shape the darkness. It was the whispers. The overseers whispered among themselves, their laughter sharp as broken glass, mocking the slaves as though their pain were sport. The slaves whispered, too, but their voices were hushed, carried only by the night wind. Whispers of escape, of rebellion, of those who had vanished into the swamp and never returned. For Clara and Sarah, whispers became daggers. They cut trust into ribbons. The sisters trusted no one but each other, for betrayal hid in every shadow. One night, as rain hammered the roof of the cabin, Clara overheard two men plotting. "We tell the overseer she's weak, can't pull her weight," one said. "He'll sell her south. Fewer mouths to feed." Sarah's name hung unspoken, but Clara felt its weight. She clenched her fists until her nails drew blood, and the sound of rain became the roar of fire in her ears. Sarah, too, heard whispers of herself. "The small one won't last. She shakes like a leaf. Overseers hate weakness." She carried these words in her chest like stones, each one heavier than the last. In the daylight, she forced her trembling hands to still, biting her lip until she tasted copper. But cruelty is quick to smell fear, and the overseers circled like hounds, waiting for the moment to pounce. And so shadows grew thicker. Ruth, the old woman who had once offered water, disappeared one night. Some said she had died quietly in her sleep. Others claimed she had been taken, punished for her kindness. No one dared to ask. No one dared to mourn aloud. The sisters understood then that kindness itself left a mark that overseers could not tolerate. Clara's silence hardened into stone. Sarah's tears grew quieter but did not vanish. They sat together in the dark, watching shadows stretch long across the walls, and knew the world around them was tightening, coil by coil. Each gesture of cruelty, each whisper of betrayal, each vanishing face, all were threads weaving a single, suffocating net. The overseers thought they ruled with whips and chains, but it was mistrust that kept the slaves bowed. And mistrust was a darker master than any overseer. It seeped into the sisters' veins, feeding silence, feeding trembling. Shadows gathered, and with them, the promise that something, whether fire, blood, or betrayal, would break. Dusk bled into the horizon, painting the fields in the color of dying embers. The air was heavy, swollen with the damp breath of the Mississippi. Overseers gathered in the yard, their voices rough, their laughter coarse. In the center stood a boy no older than 12, his eyes wide, his hands clutching at the torn sack he had carried. Cotton spilled from the rip like snow scattered over dirt, each tuft gleaming pale in the last light. For that small mistake, for a bag not stitched strong enough, punishment was declared. They dragged him forward, his feet scraping the earth, his cries already rising. 5 overseers circled him, whips coiled in their hands like serpents eager to strike. Clara stood at the edge of the rows, Sarah beside her, both frozen yet burning inside. The first lash tore the boy's back open, a scream breaking loose into the twilight. Another, and another, until his body twisted with pain, the earth beneath him smeared with blood. The sound was not merely of flesh breaking. It was the sound of something deeper, something human, tearing apart. Sarah pressed her fist to her mouth to stop the cry swelling in her throat. Her nails dug crescents in her palms, blood welling where skin gave way. "If we stay silent," she whispered, her voice trembling against the bars of her teeth, "then we are already dead." Clara did not answer. Her face was still, carved from stone, but her jaw tightened, her silence quivering with the weight of breaking. The boy collapsed, the overseers laughing, sweat glistening on their arms as though the act had been nothing more than labor in the fields. When at last he no longer moved, no longer screamed, they dropped their whips as if discarding tools. He was left in the dirt, a ruined thing, a warning splayed before every watching eye. The field had fallen into silence, not the silence of peace, but the silence of terror, sharp as the cracks still ringing in the air. That night, in the suffocating darkness of the cabins, others prayed for dawn, prayed for strength, prayed for a God who had long since turned his face away. But Clara and Sarah did not bow their heads. They sat by the embers of a dying fire, its glow licking shadows across their faces. Neither spoke, but they listened, to the cries that still echoed in their minds, to the chains that clinked faintly with every breath. The chains were not still anymore. They quivered as if waiting. Midnight lay heavy over the Mississippi, pressing against the land like a shroud. The swamps outside the quarters whispered with frogs and insects, but within the cabins, silence grew thicker than breath. Clara rose first, her shadow slipping free from the wooden floor where others lay restless in shallow sleep. Sarah followed, her steps barefoot, trembling, yet steady. Between them, wrapped in cloth to keep it from clanging, was a pot taken from the kitchen hearth. Its contents simmered until the oil glistened like molten fire. The sisters moved through the night like figures unmoored from flesh, guided by something larger than fear. The overseer's cabin stood at the edge of the yard, its door unlatched, lamplight flickering dimly through the cracks. From inside came the guttural sound of sleep, snores tangled with drunken mutterings, the faint scent of whiskey curling out into the air. Sarah's hand quivered as she touched the doorframe. Clara steadied it, eyes hard as iron. No word were needed. The silence between them was vow enough. Inside, 5 men sprawled across rough-hewn beds and the floorboards, their boots still on, their mouths slack with drink. Laughter from earlier still clung to their faces in crooked grins, as though cruelty had followed them even into dreams. The sisters stood over them, shadows against the wavering light. Sarah clutched the pot tighter, the weight of it searing her arms, the heat biting at her skin. She glanced at Clara, her lips parting as if to pray, but no prayer came. Clara took the pot. With a slow, deliberate motion, she tilted it. The oil spilled, a hiss rising as it touched flesh. At first, there was only a twitch, a murmur in sleep. Then came the screams. One by one, the overseers awoke into agony, their mouths gaping as boiling oil seared their ears, their necks, their jaws. Flesh blistered, peeling, the cabin filling with the smell of burning skin. They writhed, clawing at their faces, their howls piercing the stillness of the night. Sarah's chest heaved, her eyes wide with both horror and fierce release. Clara did not flinch. Her gaze held steady, even as men thrashed at her feet. The cabin became a furnace of terror. 5 men consumed by their own cruelty turned back upon them. The sisters did not linger. They set the pot down, empty and blackened, then slipped into the night as the air behind them filled with screams that would not end. By the time silence returned, the Mayfield sisters were already gone, swallowed by the darkness that had birthed them. Dawn did not rise gently over Vicksburg that morning. It tore itself into the sky like a wound, streaking the horizon with a pale, merciless light. The plantation stirred not with the usual groan of chains and orders, but with something rawer, more jagged. From the overseer's cabin came howls, guttural, broken, not human so much as animal. The men staggered out, faces blistered and unrecognizable, their screams ripping through the fields. By noon, 5 lay still, the air around their bodies thick with the stench of cooked flesh and whiskey, the dirt beneath them stained dark where they had thrashed. The master raged, his fury echoing across the land. He shouted orders, cursed the heavens, swore that no one would leave until the guilty were found. Dogs were unleashed, their noses pressed into mud, sniffing for traces. Armed riders scoured the swamps and forests, splashing through dark water, calling out into the trees. But the sisters were not there. Every trail dissolved in a swamp. Every footprint vanished in a mud. The land itself seemed to swallow them whole, as though complicit in their vengeance. In the cabins, the enslaved spoke only in whispers. "The Mayfield sisters are not gone," one muttered, eyes flicking toward the door as if the night might overhear. Mothers hushed children with trembling hands, warning them not to repeat what they had heard. Yet behind the warnings glimmered something else, the faintest spark of dangerous joy. For once, the lash had fallen silent. For once, overseers had tasted their own cruelty in return. At the well, a woman murmured, "They walk still, you know, barefoot, with fire in their hands." Another added, "The river hides them. The swamp protects them." No one dared say such things loudly, but in the dark corners, the whispers grew bolder. The sisters were no longer flesh alone. They were shadow, storm, legend. The master sensed it. His punishments grew harsher, his eyes sharper, as if fear gnawed at him from within. For every word spoken of Clara and Sarah, he threatened death. Yet words cannot be whipped away. They travel softer than chains, quicker than dogs, deeper than fear. By the second night, silence blanketed the quarters, but it was not the silence of terror. It was the silence of waiting. Somewhere in that stillness, chains quivered faintly, as though echoing the memory of footsteps that had already passed into legend. The Mayfield sisters were nowhere and everywhere. They searched for weeks. The master poured coin into riders and dogs, scouring every hollow of swamp and every bend of the river. Men with torches waded through reeds, their shouts scattering herons into the dusk. They found bones of deer, tracks of hogs, even the half-sunken remains of canoes, but never the sisters. Not a shred of cloth, not a broken chain, not a single sign of Clara or Sarah Mayfield remained. It was as if the night itself had taken them back. Some whispered that the Mississippi had claimed them, dragging their bodies into its endless black mouth, hiding them beneath waters that swallowed secrets whole. Others swore that they lived still, moving barefoot through the cotton rows when the moon was thin, their silence pressing against the air like a storm about to break. Mothers told their children, "If the night grows too quiet, if the air turns hot and your ears begin to ring, beware." The sisters walked close. The overseers who survived never slept soundly again. They woke at every creak of wood, every hiss of wine through the shutters, certain they would see two figures at the foot of their beds, holding fire in their hands. Some swore they heard whispers in the night. Not words, but the low sound of chains shifting, heavy and restless. The sound lingered, long after the plantation fell back into its brutal rhythm, long after the master forbade their names to be spoken. But names cannot be buried. They live in the breath of the people, in the way stories pass from fire to fire, from mother to child. Clara and Sarah Mayfield were not remembered as flesh alone. They became something else, not saints, not ghosts, but a warning. They were proof that even silence can hold a blade, that even the most broken chains can tremble before snapping. Years later, travelers passing through Vicksburg claimed that on certain nights, the fields glowed faintly, as though oil still simmered in the air. They spoke of voices, cries that were not quite human, fading into laughter that chilled the blood. And always they spoke of two shadows standing side by side, watching, waiting, their eyes dark as storm clouds over the river. The master died old, but never at peace. In his final days, he begged for candles to be kept burning, swore he could hear footsteps circling his bed. And when he passed, the field hand said the air grew hot, unbearably hot, though no fire burned. In Vicksburg, Mississippi, the year of 1811, cruelty gave birth to a legend. And legends do not die. They haunt.